Cold Justice. Chapter 1. The Closed Case. The courtroom was hushed, a tangible tension hanging in the air. The faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed above, doing little to alleviate the cold, sterile atmosphere. Prosecutor Ethan Miles stood at the center of the room, his sharp gaze sweeping over the jury. He felt the weight of the eyes on him. Every juror, every observer, every member of the press packed into the back of the courtroom. Today was not just another day. Today was the beginning of a reckoning. The defendant, Mr. Robert Cline, has spent the last 15 years believing he got away with murder. Ethan began, his voice steady but fierce. But today, justice will finally be served. The defense attorney, a slim man with slicked-back hair and a perpetually smug smile, rolled his eyes theatrically, as if to suggest that Ethan was being melodramatic. Ethan ignored him. This wasn't about theatrics. This was about making sure that Cline, a man who had evaded justice for far too long, paid for his crime. 15 years ago, a young woman named Laura Kane had disappeared. Her body was found months later, buried in a shallow grave in the woods outside of town. The investigation had been thorough, but the evidence was circumstantial. Cline, Laura's boyfriend at the time, had been the prime suspect, but without concrete proof, the case had gone cold. But Ethan had never forgotten. Even when he was a junior prosecutor, fresh out of law school, the case had haunted him. Something about Laura's eyes in the photos, bright and hopeful, now forever lost, had stuck with him. Over the years, he had quietly re-examined the evidence whenever he had the chance, convinced that Cline was guilty. And then, 6 months ago, a new witness had come forward. A witness who claimed to have seen Cline with Laura the night she disappeared, arguing near the spot where her body was later found. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reopen the case. Now, Ethan was determined to make Cline pay. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Cline had money, connections, and a seasoned defense attorney on his side. But Ethan had something more powerful: the truth. As he laid out the case for the jury, detailing the new evidence and painting a picture of Cline as a violent, jealous man who couldn't handle Laura leaving him, he could feel the tide turning in his favor. The jury was listening, leaning forward in their seats, their expressions growing more serious with every word he spoke. But just as Ethan was beginning to feel a glimmer of hope, the defense attorney stood up. "Objection, Your Honor," he said smoothly, his voice oozing with confidence. "This is all speculation. My client has been a model citizen for the past 15 years, and there is no concrete evidence linking him to this crime." The judge, an older man with graying hair and a tired expression, looked at Ethan expectantly. Ethan could feel his frustration bubbling up. He knew the defense would try to dismiss the new evidence, paint it as unreliable. But he was ready for this. "Your Honor," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm and measured, "the witness testimony is credible, and we have forensic evidence that places Mr. Cline at the scene." The judge nodded slowly. "I'll allow it," he said, and Ethan felt a small surge of triumph. But he knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was just starting. As he sat back down, he glanced over at Cline. The man's face was impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps. Ethan held his gaze, refusing to look away. This was far from over. Stay tuned for the next chapter. Will Ethan uncover more evidence? Or will Cline's defense crumble his case? Share and subscribe to find out. Chapter 2. A Witness in the Dark. Ethan sat in his cramped office, a mountain of case files stacked precariously on his desk. The glow of his computer screen illuminated his tired eyes, which were fixed on the latest statement from the new witness. The case was hanging by a thread, and he knew that every detail, every piece of evidence had to be flawless. He read through the statement again, analyzing every word. The witness, a man named Jerry Dalton, had come forward with a story that seemed too good to be true. He claimed he had been in the woods the night Laura disappeared, and he'd seen Cline arguing with her. The problem was, Jerry Dalton wasn't exactly what you'd call a reliable witness. He had a history of petty crime, and he wasn't even in the area at the time of the original investigation. The sudden appearance of this testimony felt like a gift, but Ethan couldn't help but feel uneasy. Why had Jerry waited 15 years to come forward? Why now, of all times? He knew he needed to meet with Jerry again, face to face, and see if the man was telling the truth or just trying to get something out of this. Ethan picked up the phone and dialed Jerry's number. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered, "Yeah, Mr. Dalton, this is Prosecutor Ethan Miles. I'd like to meet with you to go over your statement once more." There was a long pause on the other end, and Ethan could hear the sound of traffic in the background. Finally, Jerry spoke. "All right, I can meet you tonight. Same place as before." Ethan agreed, scribbling down the details. As he hung up, a shiver of unease ran down his spine. Something about Jerry's tone was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Hours later, Ethan found himself driving to a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. He parked his car in the gravel lot and glanced around. The diner was mostly empty, save for a couple of truckers at the counter. He walked inside and spotted Jerry in a booth at the back. The man looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to jump out at him any second. Ethan slid into the booth opposite him and ordered a coffee. "Thanks for meeting me," Ethan said, trying to put Jerry at ease. Jerry nodded, fidgeting with his hands. "You think he's going to get away with it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not if I can help it," Ethan replied. "But I need you to be completely honest with me, Jerry. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jerry hesitated, glancing around the diner again before leaning in closer. "I was scared, all right? I didn't want any trouble. But then, things started happening." Ethan's heart rate quickened. "What things?" Jerry's eyes were wide now, his fear palpable. "I've been getting these calls. No one talks, but I know someone's there. And I've seen people watching me. I think they know I saw something that night." Ethan felt a chill creep down his spine. He had expected Jerry to have some hesitation about coming forward, but this was something else entirely. "Have you reported any of this to the police?" Jerry shook his head vigorously. "No way. I don't trust them. Last time I talked to the cops, I ended up spending the night in jail for something I didn't even do. I don't want any part of this anymore, you understand?" Ethan sighed. He needed Jerry to stay involved, to testify. But he couldn't force the man, especially if he was scared for his life. "Listen, Jerry," Ethan said carefully. "I can't protect you if I don't know what's going on. If someone's threatening you, you need to tell me everything." Jerry glanced around the diner again, then back at Ethan. "I didn't just see them arguing that night," he said, his voice trembling. I saw Cline." Before Jerry could finish, the sound of glass shattering filled the diner. Jerry's eyes widened in terror, and he clutched his chest. Ethan turned just in time to see a shadowy figure outside, retreating into the darkness. He spun back to Jerry, who was slumping over, blood seeping through his fingers. Panic surged through Ethan as he leaped up, calling for help. But he already knew it was too late. Jerry Dalton was gone, and with him, the last piece of evidence that could put Cline away for good. The plot thickens. What will Ethan do now that his key witness is gone? Will he find a new lead before it's too late? Subscribe and share to stay updated. Chapter 3. The Obstruction. Ethan's hands were shaking as he sped down the highway, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The blood on his shirt was still wet, a grim reminder of how close he had been to a breakthrough, only to have it ripped away. Jerry's final words echoed in his head. I saw Cline. But what had Jerry seen? And who had silenced him? Pulling into the parking garage at the district attorney's office, Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed Detective Lisa Harris, one of the few people he trusted. Lisa was sharp, unflappable, and had a reputation for getting things done without asking too many questions. As the phone rang, Ethan's mind ran through the possible scenarios, each one worse than the last. "Lisa, it's Ethan," he said as soon as she picked up. "I need you to get to the office now. We've got a serious problem." "I'm on my way," she replied without hesitation. There was a brief pause before she asked, "Ethan, what happened?" "I'll explain when you get here," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Just hurry." Ethan ended the call and took a deep breath. He needed to stay focused. Panicking wouldn't bring Jerry back, and it wouldn't help him put Cline away. He walked briskly to his office, where he found his assistant, Grace, already there, her eyes wide with concern. "Ethan, I heard what happened at the diner," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it true? Is Jerry?" Ethan nodded grimly. "We need to act fast. Whoever did this isn't going to stop at just one witness. We're dealing with someone who's willing to kill to keep this quiet." Grace swallowed hard, but nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "Get me everything we have on Cline's associates, anyone who might have a motive for keeping this buried, and call in all the favors we have left. I want surveillance footage from every traffic camera near that diner, and I want it now." Grace nodded again and hurried out of the office, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He sat down at his desk, trying to ignore the bloodstains on his shirt, and began reviewing the case files once more. There had to be something he'd missed, some connection he hadn't seen before. Minutes later, Lisa arrived, her expression serious. She closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Ethan. "All right, fill me in," she said, her tone all business. Ethan quickly explained everything that had happened at the diner, from Jerry's sudden panic to the shadowy figure outside and the fatal shot. Lisa listened intently, her face growing more grim with each detail. "Whoever did this knew exactly where to find you," Lisa said thoughtfully, "which means they're either following you, or they've got someone on the inside feeding them information." Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. "You think we've got a mole?" Lisa shrugged. "It's possible, but right now we don't have time to worry about that. We need to focus on finding out who's behind this, and why they're so desperate to keep it quiet." Ethan nodded. "I've got Grace pulling surveillance footage from the area. Hopefully we'll catch a break there." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. What about the other witnesses from the original investigation? Could any of them have seen something they didn't realize was important at the time? Ethan considered this. Most of the original witnesses had only seen or heard about Laura and Cline's tumultuous relationship from a distance. But there was one person, an old neighbor of Laura's, Mrs. Henderson, who had been quite vocal during the initial investigation. She had insisted that Laura had come to her a few days before her disappearance, scared and looking for help. The police had dismissed it as gossip back then, but maybe there was more to it. "I'll check on Mrs. Henderson," Ethan said. "Maybe she remembers something else." Lisa nodded. "I'll go over the autopsy report again, see if there's anything we missed that could connect Cline to the scene more definitively. But Ethan, be careful. If someone's willing to kill to keep this buried, you could be next." Ethan managed a tight smile. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm not backing down. Not now." As Lisa left the office, Ethan reached for his phone again, this time calling Mrs. Henderson. The phone rang several times before an elderly voice answered, frail and tinged with a hint of suspicion. "Who is this?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Ethan Miles, from the district attorney's office. I worked on the Laura Kane case many years ago, and I'm hoping you might remember something." There was a long pause, and Ethan could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. Finally, Mrs. Henderson replied, "I told the police everything I knew back then. I don't know why you're calling me now." "Please, Mrs. Henderson," Ethan pressed. "It's important. New evidence has come to light, and we're trying to bring Laura's killer to justice. Anything you can tell me might help." Another pause, this one longer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "All right, Mr. Miles, I'll talk to you, but you'd better come quick. I'm not sure how much time I have left to help." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if she was referring to her age or something more immediate, but he wasn't about to take any chances. Grabbing his coat, he rushed out of the office, praying he wasn't too late. What secrets will Mrs. Henderson reveal? Is Ethan getting closer to the truth or walking into a trap? Hit subscribe and share to follow Ethan's dangerous journey. Chapter 4. The Hidden Message. The drive to Mrs. Henderson's house felt longer than usual, each passing second filled with an escalating sense of urgency. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional flicker of streetlights casting long shadows across the road. Ethan's mind was racing as he considered the implications of Jerry's death and the possibility of a mole in the DA's office. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was anticipated by someone who was always one step ahead. When he finally pulled up to Mrs. Henderson's small, weathered house at the end of a quiet street, he noticed all the lights were off. His heartbeat quickened. He reached for his gun, holstered under his jacket, as he stepped out of the car, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The air was thick with tension. As Ethan approached the front door, he saw it was slightly ajar. His stomach tightened, and he reached for the door slowly, pushing it open. The house was dark and silent, save for the faint sound of a television playing somewhere in the back. "Mrs. Henderson?" Ethan called out, his voice low but firm. He stepped inside cautiously, his hand hovering over his weapon. There was no response. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he moved through the narrow hallway, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. He followed the faint glow of the television into the living room. The room was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. In the dim light, Ethan could see Mrs. Henderson slumped in her armchair, the television flickering in front of her. He rushed over to her, his worst fears coming true. She was breathing, but barely, her eyes half closed, a nasty bruise forming on her forehead. "Mrs. Henderson, can you hear me?" he asked urgently, checking her pulse. It was weak, but she was alive. He quickly pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance, then knelt beside her, trying to keep her conscious. They came here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Looking for something." Ethan leaned in closer. "Who came here? What were they looking for?" She struggled to speak, her breath ragged. "I don't know, but they knew about the letters." "Letters?" Ethan asked, his mind racing. "What letters?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes flickered open for a moment, her gaze locking onto his. "Laura, she wrote me letters before she disappeared. She was scared. Said she knew something that could destroy him." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the missing piece he'd been looking for. "Where are the letters, Mrs. Henderson? Do you still have them?" She nodded weakly. "They're hidden in the attic, in a box under the floorboards." Ethan gave her a reassuring squeeze on her arm. "Stay with me, okay? Help is on the way." He glanced around the room, making sure they were still alone, then moved quickly toward the stairs leading up to the attic. The house creaked as he ascended, every step seeming to echo louder than the last. The attic was dark and cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes. Ethan pulled out his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. He moved toward the center of the room, kneeling down and feeling along the floorboards until he found one that was loose. With a bit of effort, he pried it up, revealing a small metal box hidden beneath. He pulled the box out and opened it, finding several letters yellowed with age, stacked neatly inside. His hands trembled as he unfolded the first one, his eyes scanning the words hastily scribbled across the page. "Ethan, I'm scared. I don't know who else to turn to. I think Robert is involved in something terrible. I found some documents in his office, bank statements, addresses, things that don't make sense. He's been getting money from people I've never heard of. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid if I confront him, I just don't know. Please help me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. These letters were a goldmine. If Laura had found evidence of Cline's illicit dealings, this could be the proof they needed to finally put him away. He carefully folded the letters back up and placed them in his jacket pocket. As he did, he heard a sound downstairs. A creak, like someone stepping inside the house. His pulse quickened. He reached for his gun and crept toward the attic door, listening carefully. "Ethan Miles!" a voice called out, echoing through the house. "We know you're up there. Just come down and we can talk." Ethan recognized the voice. It was Cline's defense attorney. What the hell was he doing here? Ethan moved slowly to the top of the stairs, gun drawn. "What do you want?" he shouted back. "Just to talk," the attorney replied. "There's no need for violence." Ethan knew better than to trust him. He crept down the stairs, staying close to the wall, trying to keep his breathing steady. As he reached the bottom, he saw two figures silhouetted in the doorway. Cline's attorney and another man, holding a gun. "You're not getting away with this," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "I have evidence that ties Cline to the murder, and I'm taking him down." The attorney smirked. "Oh, I don't think so, Mr. Miles. You see, we're not here to negotiate. We're here to make sure that evidence never sees the light of day." Before Ethan could react, the man with the gun lunged at him, and the room exploded in a flurry of motion. Ethan's in a tight spot. Will he manage to escape with the evidence, or will Cline's men silence him for good? Chapter 5. The Chase. Ethan barely had time to react. The man with the gun rushed toward him, his face a mask of determination. Instinct kicked in, and Ethan dodged to the side just as a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past his head and embedding itself into the wall behind him. He knew he had to act quickly. The narrow hallway offered little cover, and with Mrs. Henderson still unconscious in the other room, there was no time to waste. He swung his arm up, aiming his gun at the man's legs, and fired. The man screamed and fell to the ground, clutching his knee. Ethan's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He turned to the defense attorney, who was now holding his hands up, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and anger. "You're making a big mistake, Miles," the attorney snarled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've dealt with worse," Ethan shot back, keeping his gun trained on the attorney. "And if you don't want to end up like your friend here, you'll get out of my way." The attorney hesitated, weighing his options. For a moment, Ethan thought he might try something stupid, but then the man slowly lowered his hands, taking a step back. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over." Ethan didn't wait for a response. He knew every second counted. He quickly ran back to the living room to check on Mrs. Henderson. She was still unconscious but breathing more steadily now. He couldn't afford to stay any longer. He needed to get the letters to safety before Cline's men regrouped. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "I need an ambulance at 42 Oak Street. Elderly woman, head injury, unconscious but stable. Send backup as well, armed intruders on the scene." He hung up before the dispatcher could ask any questions. He needed to leave fast. Ethan sprinted back to his car, yanking the door open and sliding in behind the wheel. As he started the engine, he saw the defense attorney rush out of the house, shouting into his phone. Ethan didn't wait to find out who he was calling. He threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as he backed out of the driveway and sped down the street. He needed to think. Where could he go where he'd be safe, at least for a little while? The DA's office was too obvious, and he couldn't risk leading anyone back to his home. Then it hit him, Lisa's place. It was a risk, but he knew she'd have his back, and right now she was the only person he could trust. Ethan took a sharp turn onto the main road, pushing the speed limit as he weaved through traffic. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He couldn't afford any distractions. He kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights gaining on him, but so far, there was nothing. Finally, he turned onto Lisa Street, pulling up in front of her modest apartment building. He jumped out of the car, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time. He banged on her door, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Lisa opened the door almost immediately, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. "No time to explain," he said, closing the door behind him and locking it. "I've got evidence, letters from Laura Kane, that could blow this case wide open." But Cline's men are after me, and I don't know how much time we have. Lisa's eyes widened, but she didn't miss a beat. All right, let's see what you've got. Ethan pulled the letters out of his jacket pocket and handed them to her. She quickly scanned through them, her face growing more serious with each passing second. This is big, Ethan, she said quietly. If these letters are legit, we can finally nail Cline. That's what I'm hoping, Ethan replied. But first, we need to make sure these get to the right people. Lisa nodded, folding the letters and tucking them into her jacket. I'll get these to the captain. He'll know what to do, but we need to keep you safe. If Cline's willing to kill to keep this buried, he won't stop now. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew they needed to act fast. We can use these letters as leverage, he said, a plan starting to form. If we can make Cline believe we've got more than we do, we might be able to force him into making a mistake. Lisa considered this, then nodded. All right, but first, let's get you somewhere safe. I'll call for backup to keep an eye on you while I take these letters to the captain. As she reached for her phone, Ethan's own phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the caller ID. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, he answered. Ethan Miles. A familiar, icy voice greeted him. It was Cline. You've been busy tonight, Cline continued, his tone dangerously calm. But I'm afraid it's all for nothing. You see, Ethan, you can't win this game. I have too many friends, too much power. Those letters won't save you. Ethan clenched his jaw. You're going to pay for what you did, Cline. Laura deserves justice, and I'm going to make sure she gets it. Cline chuckled softly. You always were an idealist, Ethan. But ideals don't get you far in the real world. Be smart, walk away while you still can. Otherwise, you'll end up just like your witness tonight. The line went dead, leaving Ethan staring at his phone, a cold fury building inside him. He looked up at Lisa, who had been listening in. We don't have much time, he said, his voice steady. We need to move now. Chapter 6. The Trap. Ethan and Lisa moved swiftly through the dimly lit streets, their footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. The rain had started to come down in a fine mist, adding a layer of urgency to their mission. They decided to head to the one place where they could have a strategic advantage, an old, abandoned factory on the edge of town that Lisa used as an undercover surveillance spot once. It was off the grid, unmonitored, and isolated, perfect for what they needed. As they drove, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Cline had sounded confident, too confident, as if he knew something they didn't. The threat he made was chillingly precise, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Cline was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We're almost there, Lisa said, breaking the tense silence. She navigated the dark streets with precision, her focus unyielding. We'll set up in the main office on the second floor. It has a clear view of the entrance and multiple exits. Ethan nodded, gripping the letters in his hand as if they were his lifeline. We need to make sure these get to the captain, he said. Cline has people everywhere. We can't trust anyone but him. Lisa glanced over, her eyes filled with determination. We'll get them there, Ethan. But first, we need to make sure we stay alive long enough to do it. They arrived at the factory, a hulking relic from another era, its windows shattered, walls covered in graffiti. Lisa pulled the car around to the back, where a hidden entrance led directly to the stairwell. They stepped out into the rain, moving quickly but cautiously, their senses on high alert. Inside, the factory was eerily quiet. The only sounds were their footsteps and the distant drip of water from a leaky roof. They made their way up the stairs to the second floor, carefully avoiding the broken glass and debris that littered the ground. When they reached the office, Lisa set down her bag and immediately began setting up a rudimentary surveillance system, placing a small camera near the window to watch the entrance below. Ethan peered out the cracked window, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. Do you think they'll come? He asked, his voice low. Lisa didn't look up from her work. They know you have the letters. They'll come. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. They were sitting ducks, waiting for Cline to make his move. But they had no other choice. They needed to draw him out, to force him into the open where he could make a mistake. Hours passed, the tension thick in the air. Ethan's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. He knew it was Cline. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Ethan?" Cline's voice oozed through the phone, calm and taunting. "I know where you are. Did you really think you could hide from me? I've been watching you, waiting for you to lead me right to those letters." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "This ends tonight, Cline," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're not getting away this time." Cline laughed softly. "Oh, Ethan, you're so naive. This game was over before it even began. You've walked right into my trap." Before Ethan could respond, there was a loud crash downstairs. He and Lisa exchanged a quick glance, both reaching for their guns. "Stay here," Lisa whispered. "I'll check it out." Ethan shook his head. "We go together. I'm not letting you face this alone." They moved silently down the hallway, their guns raised, senses heightened. As they approached the stairs, Ethan could hear footsteps below. Heavy, deliberate. He motioned for Lisa to stay low as they crept forward. Peering around the corner, Ethan saw 3 men, dressed in black, moving through the factory floor with military precision. One of them held a flashlight, scanning the shadows, while the other 2 had their guns drawn, ready for anything. Ethan pulled back, whispering to Lisa, "They're professionals. We need to take them out quietly, one at a time." Lisa nodded, her face set in a grim determination. "I'll flank them from the left. You take the right. On my signal." Ethan waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as Lisa disappeared into the shadows, moving like a ghost. The seconds ticked by like hours, each moment stretching into an eternity. Then he saw it. A brief flicker of light from Lisa's flashlight, the signal. He moved quickly and silently, circling around to the right. As he approached the first man, he steadied his breath, aiming carefully. He fired a single shot, the silenced bullet hitting its mark. The man dropped without a sound. Lisa took out the second man with similar precision. But as Ethan turned to take aim at the third, the man suddenly spun around, his gun firing wildly. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, and Ethan dove for cover, rolling behind a stack of old crates. He could hear Lisa returning fire, but the man was moving, trying to flank her. Ethan knew he had to act fast. He popped up from behind the crates, firing 2 quick shots. One missed, but the other hit the man square in the chest. He fell to the ground, his gun clattering away. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan and Lisa exchanged a look, both breathing heavily. "That's not all of them," Ethan said, his voice tense. "Cline's got more men." As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed through the factory, louder this time, coming from all directions. Ethan realized they were surrounded. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said urgently. "Now." Ethan nodded, and they began to move, making their way back toward the stairs. But just as they reached the doorway, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was Cline, a cold smile on his face, a gun in his hand. "You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you?" Cline sneered. "This ends now, Ethan." Ethan raised his gun, but he knew he was outmatched. Cline had the advantage, and there was nowhere left to run. Ethan and Lisa are trapped. Will they find a way out, or has Cline finally won? Subscribe and share to find out what happens in the thrilling conclusion. Chapter 7. The Last Stand. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he faced Cline. The rain outside hammered against the factory's rusted windows, the noise almost deafening. Cline's cold smile didn't waver as he stepped closer, his gun steady in his hand. The tension was thick, a palpable force that seemed to press in on Ethan from all sides. "This ends here," Cline repeated, his voice a menacing growl. "Hand over the letters, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here alive." Ethan didn't flinch. "You know I can't do that, Cline. Those letters are going to put you away for life. It's over for you." Cline's eyes narrowed, his calm exterior slipping just a bit. "I don't think you understand your situation, Ethan. I have men surrounding this place. Even if you shoot me, you're not getting out of here." Ethan's mind raced. He knew Cline wasn't bluffing about his men. They'd already encountered some of them. But he also knew that if he gave up now, if he handed over the letters, Laura would never get justice. He had to stall, buy them some time. Lisa, who had been standing beside Ethan, took a small step forward, her gun still trained on Cline. "There's one thing you're forgetting, Cline," she said, her voice strong and clear. "You might have men, but you don't have loyalty. How much do you think they're willing to risk for you? How much are they being paid to throw their lives away?" Cline's smile faltered, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Ethan seized the moment. "Your men might work for you, Cline, but they don't know what you've done. They don't know you're a murderer, a coward hiding behind a pile of dirty money." The words seemed to hit their mark. For the first time, Cline looked uncertain, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Ethan knew he had to press his advantage. He took a step forward, his gun still trained on Cline. "This is your last chance, Cline. Call off your men, surrender, and maybe we can work something out. Maybe we can find a way for you to save some part of your life." Cline's eyes flickered between Ethan and Lisa, and for a moment, it seemed like he might be considering it. But then his face hardened, his resolve returning. "I've come too far to stop now, Ethan. I won't let you take everything I've built." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the factory, followed by a series of gunshots. Ethan ducked instinctively, pulling Lisa down with him behind a stack of old crates. The factory erupted into chaos as Cline's men moved in, guns blazing. Ethan and Lisa fired back, trying to hold their ground. Bullets whizzed past, striking metal and concrete, filling the air with sparks and debris. The narrow office space was quickly becoming a death trap. "We need to move," Lisa shouted over the noise. Ethan nodded, and they began to fall back toward the staircase, keeping low and using the crates as cover. Cline's men were advancing quickly, and Ethan knew they wouldn't be able to hold them off for long. As they reached the stairs, Ethan heard a familiar voice, Cline, shouting orders. "Don't let them get away. They have the letters." Ethan glanced at Lisa. "We have to make it to the roof. It's our only chance." Lisa nodded, and they sprinted up the stairs, bullets ricocheting around them. They reached the roof access door and burst through it, stepping out into the pouring rain. The wind whipped around them, and the slick rooftop was a maze of old machinery and broken skylights. "We need to find cover," Lisa said, scanning the rooftop. "They'll be right behind us." Ethan nodded, leading the way toward a large ventilation unit. They crouched behind it, catching their breath. Ethan checked his gun, only a few rounds left. He glanced at Lisa, who gave him a grim nod. "We're running out of options," she said quietly, "but we can't let them get the letters." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He knew they had to act fast. "We need to create a diversion," he said, thinking quickly. "If we can draw their fire, we might be able to get to the fire escape on the far side." Lisa nodded. "I'll cover you. When I give the signal, make a run for it." Ethan hesitated for a moment, but he knew it was their best shot. "Be careful," he said, gripping his gun tightly. Lisa nodded, then rose up from behind the ventilation unit, firing a few shots toward the stairwell where Cline's men were emerging. "Go!" she shouted. Ethan sprinted toward the fire escape, the rain blinding him as he ran. He heard more gunfire, the sharp cracks echoing off the rooftop, but he didn't stop. He reached the edge of the roof and grabbed the ladder, beginning to climb down as fast as he could. As he descended, he glanced up and saw Lisa moving toward the ladder as well, firing back at their pursuers. But then, he saw Cline emerge from the stairwell, his gun trained directly on her. "Lisa, look out!" Ethan shouted, but his voice was lost in the rain and chaos. Cline fired, and Lisa stumbled, falling to the ground. "No!" Ethan yelled, his heart plummeting. He knew he couldn't go back, not without risking everything. He reached the bottom of the ladder and ducked into the alley, his mind racing. He had to keep moving. He had to get the letters to safety. As he ran through the dark, rain-soaked streets, he heard sirens in the distance. Backup was finally arriving, but he didn't know if it would be enough. He had to believe that Lisa was okay, that she could hold them off just a little longer. Ethan reached his car, drenched and exhausted. He threw the letters onto the passenger seat and started the engine, peeling out of the alley. He had one last chance to end this, to bring Cline down once and for all. As he drove, his mind was filled with images of Laura, of Jerry, of Mrs. Henderson. He thought of all the people who had been hurt, all the lives that had been destroyed. He knew he couldn't stop now. He had to see this through, no matter the cost. He sped toward the police station, his tires screeching on the wet pavement. He had to get there before Cline, before his men could stop him. He had to make sure that justice was served. Will Ethan make it to the police station in time to secure the evidence? Will justice finally be served? Subscribe and share to see the explosive conclusion to this suspenseful journey. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.